One thing you will get from the popular culture sometime when people are chattering about the Crusades, especially like in YouTube comment sections, is you'll see this idea presented by some people. Oh, well, the Crusades were just about greed. They weren't about religion. They weren't about, doing something for your fellow Christians. This was about going off to the Holy Land just so you could grab a bunch of plunder and get wealthy. And the truth is, this is most certainly an inaccurate and oversimplified way of looking at Crusades history. And any Crusade scholar is going to tell you this is not correct. The source material definitely doesn't support this. So let's talk a little bit about motivation and crusading today. When we look at how the medieval church conceived of crusading, certainly the church conceived of crusading as this idea of an act of Christian brotherly love. So the idea is that you're setting off on this expedition to help Christians who are in peril, whether this be in Spain or the Holy Land. This kind of thing just would have been a very big deal. This is something that people would have really thought of when they conceived of crusading. A couple of sources we're going to look at. First of all, Pope Urban's speech at Clermont, the speech that launched the Crusades. It is the only warfare that is righteous, for it is charity to risk your life for your brothers. So right there we kind of see this idea that crusading obviously is dangerous. You're risking life and limb. You're doing this for your fellow Christians. Now, I'm not saying that this was the sole motivation for crusading, that every single person who went on crusade, this is what they were thinking of, and only this. I think human beings have complex motivations, but I think there's no question this was hugely important, and this was a big motivating factor for a lot of people. Another thing we're going to look at, this is from Spain, so looking at crusading in Spain and Portugal. They stressed too that the war was essentially one of defense and liberation of fellow Christians. In the words of Pope Calixtus II, for the defense of our brothers and the liberation of the churches in Spain from the killings and disasters brought about by the oppression of the pagans. And one more source here. This is from the Second Crusade. This is from a source associated with the conquest of Lisbon in Portugal. This is from a speech delivered to the Crusader army by a bishop as conceived by the author of this chronicle. He who does not ward off an injury from his comrades and brothers, if he can, is as much at fault as he who does the injury. Okay, so that is something that makes sense to us, this concept that something bad was happening to other Christians and it was the duty of the Crusaders to do something about it. A common theme with the Crusades too was this idea that the goal of this was to do something for Christendom, to do something good as a Christian, as opposed to the gaining of wealth, the gaining of booty. Now plunder, acquiring wealth through warfare, this is a common thing, and this is something that medieval warriors understood. Often this was how an army was paid, was a ruler would use plundered property to pay his soldiers. So for soldiers from this period of time, they would have understood this, but it was emphasized that this shouldn't be the motivation for crusading. Again, we're going to look at, from the Second Crusade, the conquest of Lisbon. From that same speech, act like good soldiers, for the sin is not in fighting war, but in fighting for the sake of booty. So, although we have this idea that, this is a spiritually motivated thing, and crusaders are men who are setting out to help their fellow Christians, at the same time, that doesn't mean necessarily that from everyone's perspective that material reward was incompatible with this mission. There's a very interesting passage from Fulcher of Chartres. I think a lot of you guys who watch the channel have heard of this chronicle. Fulcher of Chartres was one of the most important chroniclers of the First Crusade. He was present for a lot of it. He was the chaplain to Baldwin of Boulogne, one of the leaders of the First Crusade. This is a famous line that he wrote in his chronicle toward the end of the chronicle, and his chronicle goes from the First Crusade all the way toward the end of the 1120s. So it covers a lot of the early history of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And Fulcher himself was a settler in the Crusader states, and so he comments on the transformation of himself and the various Crusaders as they settled in the East. They became kind of enmeshed in this Eastern culture, this Eastern setting. What he says here is, our relatives and parents join us from time to time, sacrificing, even though reluctantly, all that they formerly possessed. Those who were poor in the Occident, God makes rich in this land. Those who had little money there have countless bezants here, and those who did not have a villa possess here by the gift of God a city. Therefore, why should one return to the Occident, who has found the Orient like this? God does not wish those to suffer want who with their crosses dedicated themselves to follow him, nay, even to the end. So that's kind of interesting. He's implying here that warriors who participate in this war, which is holy according to God, God is going to reward them materially. So it's not just spiritual rewards, it's material rewards as well. And he's saying that this is in keeping with God's plan. Historians have long pointed out that this is probably a bit of recruitment propaganda from Voltaire, because he understands that the way that medieval literature was consumed, often it was read aloud in court settings. So, you've got a group of nobles hanging out in a king's court or a count's court or whatever. For entertainment, they will hear books read aloud, books of heroism, chronicles, accounts of what's going on in other parts of the world, information about what was happening in the Crusader states. This would have been of much interest. So the Crusader states were always in need of fighters. They were always in need of knights. So Fulcher, in his chronicle, he does slip little things in there here or there that, if a knight was hearing this in some, great nobleman's court somewhere in the West, he might think to himself, yeah, that sounds pretty good. I might try to get in on that. So I think we can kind of look at this medieval mindset and understand that there's not a contradiction between this idea of holy war and success in holy war and worldly success. I mean, on the one hand, we have to understand this is a necessity, right? I mean, if we're talking about the idea of the Crusades is we're going to go into non-Christian territory, conquer it, and bring it under Christian political dominion. So if previously a portion of Spain or the Holy Land was ruled by a Muslim prince, a crusade is meant to conquer it, remove him from power, and put a Christian prince in his place. So in this scenario, worldly success is a given. I mean, in terms of a goal. I mean, you are working toward a conquest, a material conquest. So we can see how, this idea that, just because you are achieving worldly success because you succeed in crusading, this doesn't contradict with this spiritual motivation. This might be something that's kind of tough for us to understand in our thinking today, because there's such a divide between a concept like political order and religion. Whereas in the medieval world, religion was a crucial component of the political order. People felt that it was important for the state to have some stake in the religion, to endorse the religion. And this is true for Muslims and Christians. Somebody setting off on crusade, they could have both the goal of doing something spiritual, doing something for God, and also think that this might turn out well for them in terms of their career. There was not necessarily a single and totally unified way of imagining crusading. On the one hand, you've got this idea that, there should be no material motivation, but then we can see from Fulcher that there is material motivation in the way he's presenting it. So having looked at some of that, I think it might be interesting to ask ourselves what motivated the average crusader. If we're trying to imagine your average medieval crusader who is not, a high-ranking clergyman or not a king or a great lord, but just an ordinary knight, even a foot soldier, whatever, what motivated such a person? I think, first of all, we can point out that people tend to have many motivations when they are engaged in any enterprise. I mean, you can be personally motivated towards something, financially motivated toward it, spiritually motivated toward it, different degrees of that. For some, one of those might be stronger than another. I think there were some theaters of crusading that would be more attractive in any of those given areas. And so that might help determine which area you would gravitate toward. In an age of piety, this was most certainly one of the big ways you could express your piety. And this was a time when religious piety was very mainstream, when people would have been very much inculcated in religious piety. And so this was a real feeling for a lot of people. That's one thing, we get wrong if we imagine that somehow there was a lot of religious hypocrisy at this time. I mean, we live in an age where it's a lot easier to imagine religious hypocrisy because so many people are skeptical of religion. But the truth is, in the medieval world, people really believed this. This was This was the fundamental reality of their world. And even if you were maybe not so much motivated by love for God, a fear of God alone would make you consider religion. So we have to take that into account. And in a lot of cases, considering the danger involved in crusading, it's impossible to understand how someone would do it other than that. But of course, the other element is this idea of heroism, prestige, because the truth is, again, in an age of great piety, in an age when the goals of the nobility and the church were becoming more and more aligned with one another, and the church had succeeded in kind of Christianizing knighthood and helping to promote this idea of the Christian knight, this was the greatest act of heroism that you could engage in. So if you're a knight, if you're a man of war, if you're a man of valor who admires courage and you want to be viewed as someone who's courageous, crusading is attractive to you, because this is not just like ordinary kind of run-of-the-mill warfare where, of course, everybody wants to make a buck from plunder or something like that. Crusading, this is high-level stuff. So it's almost like the difference between today, you imagine somebody who just runs a business in their local community or works for even a corporation, versus somebody who goes off and does some great act of charity overseas or something. People, somebody might engage in a charitable act today, not just because they are a big humanitarian, but because they want the prestige that goes along with that. People will look at that and admire that. So we have to think about it that way. Crusading was the equivalent of the great charitable act in the medieval Latin world. I think if we're talking about the Crusades in Spain and Portugal, it's a lot easier to understand the material advantage for somebody getting involved in this. Because first of all, it's close in terms of the rest of Latin Christian Europe. If you're in France, you just go down to Spain. It's right there. And on top of that, you've got kings and nobles in Spain who are in control of the Christian parts of the territory with very stable regimes. They are sponsoring crusaders. They're asking men to come down, and they're kind of laying it out like, look, if you come down here, I'll set you up with lands. I will split the booty with you. Perfect example of this, Alfonso the Battler, the King of Aragon. He brought all sorts of knights down from Normandy and France who came down and participated in his crusading. Some of them got estates, all this kind of thing. So I can see how the Reconquista, Spain, would be more attractive if you were thinking, okay, I'm looking to gain some wealth doing this. I'm looking for an opportunity in terms of my career. Very different, I would say, would be the Holy Land, the theater we often associate with crusading. Okay, the Holy Land, Jerusalem, fighting in the holy places against the Muslims who occupy this territory. This is a very different thing just in terms of the risk involved. I mean, obviously there's risk in any warfare, but the Holy Land, this is a hugely dangerous undertaking. It's far away. It's remote from the rest of Latin Christendom. It's pretty deep into Muslim territory, pretty deep into enemy territory. Putting aside Fulcher of Chartres' little sales pitch we just read a little while ago, there was very little opportunity to get rich over here. Very few people could expect to go over there and become wealthy. He talked about somebody, they don't possess a villa in the West, and then they go out to the Holy Land, they possess a city. Tiny number of people who, that was just the very upper nobility, great lords could expect that. On top of that, after the First Crusade, people understood this. After that, people had a better understanding of what was involved in crusading in the Eastern Levant. The stories were coming back of the suffering that people endured. Again, very far away, very hard to get to. Even getting to the theater of the battle is very difficult. It involves an arduous journey, either by ship or very difficult overland journey. It was hugely expensive. People bankrupted themselves doing this. Godfrey of Bouillon sold or mortgaged all of his lands to do this. One of the great lords of the Holy Roman Empire, the Duke of Lorraine, he basically sank everything he had into doing this to finance his army. It was financially ruinous for a lot of people. Again, the journey itself was very dangerous. It was dangerous, though, just leaving your home territory behind you. If you were a nobleman and you were setting off and leaving your lands behind you, your lands were open to attack by your neighbors, potentially. One big misconception is this idea that everybody who went on crusade was like a younger son, and the eldest sons, they stayed behind, they had lands. But Jonathan Riley Smith has shown that the rule more was that families or entire clans tended to go on crusade together. So if the younger son was going, probably the eldest son was going too. He was probably the one paying for the whole thing. Somebody had to pay for the expedition, for the supplies, for the weapons, all this stuff. Younger sons would need somebody who could pay for this stuff to do it. So the real question here is, what was there to gain for your average sort of lower ranking nobleman or even peasant to go on crusade? I mean, all this risk, all this expense, incredible danger, physical danger. Even if you survive the journey, you could easily die in battle before you even reach Jerusalem in the Holy Land, whatever it is. What are you going to gain? Are you going to be able to strip some armor off of a dead Saracen? Maybe find like a fine piece of jewelry or something in a sacked city? Whatever it is. I mean, the opportunities for plunder were pretty limited in the Holy Land. Especially, even if you were able to gain some plunder, the question is, given everything you'd have to sacrifice, the incredible expense, the risk that you're taking, is it worth it? And I think we can see, in most cases, people who were more interested in being wealthy or who were more focused on that kind of thing were not the type of people who were going to be attracted to this, what was at the time kind of the big idealistic adventure that people were undertaking. So I guess what I'm saying here is crusading tended to be more something that you did if you were an idealist, rather than if you were a practical money-making type. So jumping back to this thing of prestige, we talk about, okay, as a knight, in the age of the Crusades, going on crusade, this was the great heroic act you could perform. If you were someone who was very inspired by that kind of thing, crusading was attractive to you. I think if we look at somebody like Richard the Lionheart, we can see this very clearly. Richard the Lionheart didn't gain anything financially at all by crusading. In fact, it was something that was dangerous to his finances. It was dangerous to his very kingdom in a lot of ways. If we ask ourselves, why did he do this? I think surely his piety, his desire to help the Christians in the East was at play. But I also think we can see Richard the Lionheart wanted to embody, knightly greatness. And so the crusade was an attractive avenue for that. Now, on a very different note, we look at one of Richard's fellow crusaders, Philip II of France. I think Philip II is the classic reluctant crusader. This is a king who wasn't particularly pious, I think. And I also don't think he was particularly moved by, knightly courage or the idea of being kind of a courageous, chivalric ideal. I think he felt pressured to do this, and that's one of the reasons, he set off on crusade. This was the overwhelming mood of the time. And he went home as quickly as he could. I think Philip II was somebody who was more concerned with things like wealth and power. And that's one of the reasons he didn't remain on crusade for very long. He abandoned the whole thing as quickly as he possibly could. So I'll just close with that. In short, I think we can look at the history of crusading, and we can see that the motivations for crusading were complicated. The idea that this was just all about greed is ridiculous. It's absurd. The evidence does not support that. But yeah, I think especially we do have to look at the religious element of this. The piety thing was a huge deal in the age of faith, which, that's when crusading took place. But also the idea of prestige, knightly prestige. So that's it for today, guys. Hope you enjoyed the video. I want to close off today by reading a little note I received from one of my Patreon supporters. This is from Adam Nordskog, and he writes, "Just read Why Does the Heathen Rage? I couldn't put it down. Always looking forward to more of your work. The novel was fast-paced and fun to read." So Adam, I just want to say thanks so much for reading my book. I'm glad you enjoyed it. That little message meant a lot to me, so thanks for taking the time to send it. Again, hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll talk to you soon.